She was humiliated for selling candy on the street. But an act of courage in the middle of traffic made even a powerful judge kneel before her. You won't believe what happened next. She was just a girl, with a styrofoam box in her hands and a broken pair of slippers on her feet, but in her eyes there was something impossible to ignore. A mixture of tiredness, hope, and a quiet strength that many adults had long since lost. Lara walked the sidewalks of the city as if she belonged to another world, a world that few people wanted to see. While others went to school with a backpack on their backs, she carried candy wrapped in aluminum foil and a routine that was too hard for someone who had not yet turned 10. Even before daylight, she was already on her feet, carefully stacking brigadeiros in the blue box. That wasn't just chocolate rolled with sprinkles. It was the sustenance of the day, the possible breakfast, the uncertain lunch, and perhaps, if there was anything left, dinner. She went out alone, always on the same route. She went up the narrow street of the simple neighborhood where she lived and went to the city center. There he waited for the light to close to approach the cars with quick steps and a contained smile. Sometimes he offered the sweet with shyness. Other times, she didn't even have to speak. She just held out the box with a look that said it. Oh, but the world does not always have the patience to listen to the silence of children, and much less to look into the eyes of someone who sells sweets on the street. Many drivers closed the window before she even got close. Some pretended to answer the phone. Others simply ignored her presence as if she were part of the urban scenery. Something invisible, uncomfortable, disposable. And there were still the worst, those who treated her with contempt, with words that cut more than the cold of the early mornings. "Go to work, girl," they shouted. "Get out of here, it's disrupting traffic." Lara never answered. He lowered his eyes, pressed the box to his chest and moved on, swallowing his pride and insults with the same discipline of someone who learns early that he has no time to be offended. "Even with the humiliation," she continued, "not out of stubbornness, but out of necessity. And for something even stronger, a hidden dream that she didn't tell anyone. He dreamed of studying, to put on a clean uniform, to carry a new notebook, to write on unblemished sheets. She dreamed of entering a classroom, raising her hand to answer questions, being called by her full name and not by Candy Girl. I dreamed of being someone. But between the dream and the reality, there was an abyss made of cement, horns, and hurried steps that never stopped to hear his voice. Still, every day she crossed that chasm with courage. I sold 1, 2, 3 brigadeiros, sometimes none. Sometimes a stranger would smile and buy 2 just to help, and that was enough to rekindle a little bit of faith in her heart. Lara counted the coins at the end of the day as if telling promises. He knew that it might take years to save enough to change his life, but I kept believing, because deep down, even without knowing how, she felt that something was waiting for her. Something bigger than the styrofoam box, bigger than the dirty sidewalks, bigger than the contempt of the adults who never wanted to know his name. What Lara didn't know was that fate sometimes observes in silence the small gestures of courage. And when you least expect it, he also runs across the street, without warning, without preparation, without logic. And everything changes. Sometimes it takes a moment, a second of momentum, a quick look, a step in the right direction, or in the direction of danger, for an entire life to change course. On that specific day, the heat already made the asphalt floor shine. Lara had already walked 3 corners, hit dozens of glasses, sold a few brigadeiros, but he did not give up. The light closed, and she ran once more to try one last sale before heading home. But it was then that something happened, something that would make time seem to stop for a moment. Something that would test his mettle like never before. If you're feeling the same thing she felt that day, a tightness in her chest, a mixture of fear and urge, then you can imagine what was coming. But the truth is that not even Lara, with all her silent strength, could have foreseen what was about to happen. Did you like this story? So leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? The sun was already starting to boil the asphalt when Lara stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, adjusting the worn handle of the styrofoam box on her shoulder. That would be his last attempt of the day. The brigadeiros were no longer so fresh. The water in the bottle had run out and my feet hurt, punished by the long walks. Still, she believed that she might sell one or two more before returning home. The red light came on, and as on so many other occasions, Lara ran. I knew the exact time before the green returned. He knew which lane was busiest, where cars with more generous drivers usually stopped, and how aiming at the right eyes could be more effective than any words. But at that moment, something different caught his attention. A cutting sound of hurried footsteps, childish laughter, and a muffled scream echoed across the avenue, the kind of sound that wasn't part of the routine soundtrack of his day. In a matter of seconds, Lara's eyes found a scene that didn't make sense. A small girl, in a light dress and new shoes, running in the middle of the asphalt as if she were playing in a park, and right behind, a desperate woman trying to reach her, stumbling in her own steps, shouting words that were lost in the noise of impatient engines. Lara stopped. For a millisecond, he thought about continuing to offer his sweets, but his body did not obey. He acted before the mind processed any logic. He dropped the box on the floor, not worrying about what would break inside, and ran with everything. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground. Everything around him disappeared. The cars, the screams, the heat. There was only that girl, fragile and vulnerable, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the car that was coming at high speed. Without even showing signs of braking, the following moments were not real. They seemed like a blurred, silent scene, with time stretching in a cruel way. Lara dove towards the child, as if the world would explode if she didn't arrive in time. And, by centimeters, by a final breath of luck or miracle, he reached the girl and pulled her hard to the sidewalk. The car passed so close that the wind from the impact ruffled their hair. There were screams, horns, curses. People ran. The nanny finally caught up with the child, lying on the floor with trembling hands. Lara was on her knees, her breathing unbalanced, her arms protecting the girl as if they were walls. The whole body trembled, but what hurt the most was not physical. It was the fright. The real fear that if he had hesitated for a second, everything would have been different. Gradually the sounds returned. The heat was on. Lara's hands were grated and dirty. The brigadeiros had spread out on the street, many crushed by the wheels of impatient cars. The box had turned on its side, the lid loose, and along with it part of his sustenance for the week. But she didn't even look at it. He could only observe the girl sitting next to him, frightened but alive. His face was round, his brown eyes still teary with fright. The light dress was now stained with dust and a little blood on her knee, and she didn't say anything. He just stared at Lara as if trying to understand what had just happened. The nanny, desperate, grabbed the child and held her in her arms, saying meaningless words, while looking at Lara with a mixture of panic, relief, and shock. There was no thanks. Not at that moment. There was only chaos. People approached, asked if she was okay, offered some water, but no one really saw Lara. No one understood who that thin, sweaty, dust-covered girl was, with a courage that didn't seem to fit. In that tiny body, minutes passed. The nanny picked up her cell phone with trembling hands and made a hurried call. The tone of his voice changed. It was clear that he was talking to someone important. He spoke of an accident, of near tragedy, of a street girl who had saved the child. The words seemed charged with dread, but also with relief and urgency. What Lara didn't know was that, a few blocks away, a black car was advancing through the streets with a father's heart racing in the chest. A powerful man, accustomed to control firm decisions, the law. But at that moment, all that mattered to him was his daughter, and her life had just been saved by a stranger. Meanwhile, Lara was still there, trying to compose herself. He looked at the destroyed sweets with resignation. That was more than food. It was the effort of hours of lost work. But curiously, there was no revolt. There was a strange feeling that everything had happened for a reason. The blood on her knees burned, her heart beat like a runaway drum, but inside her, a different calm began to be born. I didn't know where it came from or what it meant. But in that sudden silence, Lara felt that something was about to happen, something that had nothing to do with coins or chocolates. The people around began to disperse. The signal worked again, the cars resumed their hurried pace, as if trying to erase what they had just witnessed. And Lara, alone among the pieces of what had been her morning, little did she know that this moment, that choice to throw herself in front of a car to save a life, had just drawn a new path, completely different from anything she had imagined. And then, in the midst of that suffocating heat and the noise that filled the room again, something interrupted normality with the force of an internal siren, the sound of tires braking, a car door slamming, quick footsteps approaching. These were no ordinary steps. They had a different weight. They were in a hurry, purposeful, desperate, and they were coming exactly towards him. The sound of footsteps became clearer, closer, more charged. Lara looked up, still dizzy, and saw the crowd open as if an invisible force pushed her to the sides. A tall man in a dark suit and disturbed expression appeared among the onlookers, his gaze sweeping the place in despair until he found his daughter sitting on the sidewalk. He ran up to her, knelt down without thinking, and wrapped her in a tight embrace, completely ignoring the dust, the blood on his knee, and the confusion around him. It was as if, at that moment, the whole world had been summed up in the relief of knowing that her daughter was alive. Lara, a few steps away, was still silent. I watched the scene without knowing what to feel. On the one hand, there was the tranquility of having avoided a tragedy. On the other, a strange discomfort. I wasn't used to being noticed, much less involved in moments like that. His presence almost always went unnoticed. But now, suddenly, everyone seemed to be looking at her, some with curiosity, others with surprise. And that man, who until then had been absorbed in his own pain, finally looked up and stared at her. Watched her for a few seconds, as if trying to fit an image that doesn't make sense. In front of him was not a paramedic, a nanny, or an adult woman. There was only one girl, a sweaty child, with his face sunburned and his hands still shaking, surrounded by crushed candy. The contrast was as absurd as it was moving. It was only then that he understood what had really happened. She had been responsible for preventing the tragedy. That slight girl wearing shabby clothes had risked her own life to save his daughter. And now she was there, alone, as if it was just another part of the day. He approached slowly. The crowd was already beginning to disperse. The heat was bothering again, and the cars resumed their flow as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for this man, something had changed irreversibly. There was gratitude in his eyes, but also bewilderment. He could hardly speak. It wasn't for lack of words, it was for excess of feeling. The strength of Lara's gesture surpassed any formality. There was no way to repay that with a full wallet or a beautiful phrase, but still he tried. He looked inside his pocket for something he could offer, an automatic gesture, as if money could express the size of what he felt. He took a few notes, held out his hand, but something in Lara's expression made him stop. There was no avarice in her eyes nor pride. There was only a strange tranquility, as if what he had done was something simple, natural, necessary. She shook her head slightly and mumbled something so low that it could hardly be heard. He leaned in, trying to understand. And what she said was no ordinary request. It was not food, nor clothes, nor shelter. It was a phrase that broke something inside that man, a pure, honest, and deep desire. A desire that did not come from the lack of today, but from the hope of a different tomorrow. That caught him off guard. It messed with something that had been dormant for a long time. Because of all the requests he had ever heard in his life, and he had heard many, this one was different. I didn't ask for a favor. I asked for a chance. He wanted to know who that girl was, where he lived, who he lived with, how he survived. And the more he discovered, the more the silence deepened within him. Lara lived alone with a sick aunt in a small house forgotten by all. She sold sweets to support the house, to buy medicine, to maintain some dignity in a world that insisted on pushing her to the margins. She was one among many who passed invisible, who grew up without a future, who survived without witnesses. But now he was a witness, and he could no longer unsee what he had seen, nor did he misunderstand what he had felt. There was something about that girl that went beyond the heroic gesture. It was the silent strength of those who, even without having anything, were still able to offer everything. From whom, even though she was hurt by the world, she was still able to protect it. The man introduced himself, but Lara did not immediately recognize the name. She didn't know who he was, nor the power he carried with that suit, that name, that surname whispered with reverence by some curious people around. She didn't know that she had just saved her daughter from one of the state's most respected judges, known for his rigor, his ethics, and his discretion. For her, he was just the father of that girl. And that was enough. He promised to help her. He promised to take care of it. And as much as Lara had heard many promises before, so many that she learned not to expect anything from anyone else, there was something in this man's eyes that kept her from doubting. It wasn't just gratitude that moved him. It was a kind of moral debt that he felt he needed to honor, not with money, but with something that had real value. A new beginning. An opportunity. She didn't say anything. He just nodded, his body still, aching and his knees burning. He collected what was left of the candy box, now almost empty, and prepared to leave. The saved girl was still watching her, her eyes wide, as if she were facing a mystery. And maybe he was. Because heroes don't always wear capes, don't always arrive in armored cars or make speeches. Sometimes they appear barefoot, with the smell of sugar and courage in their eyes. As Lara walked away on the sidewalk, the judge stood there for a while, motionless, with his daughter in his arms. He watched that small figure disappear among the cars, taking with him not only an unbelievable story, but a new meaning that he still couldn't explain. It was as if a door had been opened before him, a door that gave access not to a courtroom, but to something far more human, deeper, more true. On that day, the city took its course. The horns came back, the traffic lights worked, the hurried passers-by ignored the details. But for two different worlds that touched each other for a few minutes, that of the girl with sweets and that with the man with laws, nothing would be the same as before. The judge knew he needed to act. And fast. Because that girl, with all her sweetness, courage, and invisibility, had awakened in him a rare feeling, the certainty that sometimes justice begins far away from the courts. Time, which used to be just the interval between one traffic light and another for Lara, began to gain another rhythm. There was no longer honking horns, hurried steps, and averted looks. Now, the days were measured by pages turned, pencils sharpened, the sounds of school bells, and silent learnings that flourished within her without fanfare. The change did not come as an immediate miracle. It wasn't like waking up in a completely different place. It came gradually, like the morning light that invades the house slowly, first through the cracks in the window, then spreading without asking permission. That week, when two well-dressed women knocked on the door of the shack where she lived, with her aunt, Lara didn't know what to expect. She was used to visits that brought demands or empty promises. But those women came at the judge's behest, this she heard clearly, and were there to take her to a place where she would have something to eat, where she would no longer have to sleep, listening to the sound of gunshots in the distance, or waking up afraid of the rain invading the mattress. Lara hesitated. He was afraid of the new, fear that it was all a trap disguised as kindness. But there was something in the older social worker's eyes that made her accept. It was a look similar to that of someone who has suffered, but survived. It was the kind of look that you don't learn in college. When she arrived at the new shelter, Lara found everything strange. There was no smell of frying in the air. There was no screaming of the neighbor fighting with her husband. The walls were clean, the bathroom had soap, and the most unbelievable, the shower was heating up. She didn't know whether to be happy or suspicious. The first night was with my eyes open, sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for someone to come along to say that it was all a mistake. But no one came, and the next day they put in his hands a backpack with new notebooks and a uniform that smelled of fabric softener. That, yes, seemed like a dream too distant to be real. At school, Lara felt out of place. The other children talked about cartoons, outings with their parents, birthdays with cake and toys. She didn't know what to say. But there was one thing that no one there had with the same intensity: will. Lara paid attention to everything. Every word of the teacher was written down carefully. Each explanation, absorbed as someone who collects rare opportunities. It didn't take long for teachers to notice. It was as if she had kept all her potential for years, and now she finally had a place where she could let it go. Gradually, she stopped being the new girl to become a reference. He excelled in reading, then in mathematics, and when it came time to write an essay about what she wanted to be when she grew up, she wrote with such passion that the teacher couldn't hold back her tears. Lara wanted to be a lawyer, not because I had seen it in a movie, but because I felt the absence of justice in my skin. She wanted to understand the laws. She wanted to know how to protect others. She wanted, above all, to make sure that no child went through what she went through. The judge, even though he did not appear directly, followed everything. I received reports, asked for updates, knew the grades, the challenges, the small victories of the day-to-day. He never imposed himself as a savior, nor as a visible protector. He knew that true transformation doesn't impose itself. It allows itself. And Lara was flourishing in her own right. Help came behind the scenes, but she was the one who took the stage every day, facing the fear of the unknown, the insecurity, her of not thinking she was enough, the pressure of carrying so much responsibility on such small shoulders. Time went on. The weeks turned into months. Lara already knew the way to school by heart. I already had a routine that included homework, recess, books borrowed from the library, and for the first time, plans for the future. Sometimes, when night fell and silence took over the shelter, she still wondered if it was all permanent. He was afraid that something would happen, that everything would be taken away from him like a snap. But each new day without disaster was a small victory, and each well-done test, each sincere compliment, each new notebook delivered, was a brick in the construction of something she didn't even know she was doing, her new life. Even with the changes, Lara did not move away from her essence. She remained simple, gentle, observant. She was the first to help her colleagues, the last to leave the room, the one who paid the most attention to details. There was an unusual maturity in her. I knew I couldn't make a mistake. She felt that. She carried not only her own destiny, but also a kind of silent commitment to all the girls who were left behind. The ones who still sold sweets at the signs, the ones who were not lucky enough to cross the path of a grateful judge. It was also for them that Lara studied. It was for them that she kept quiet when she wanted to give up. From time to time, she met the judge again in brief, formal meetings. He always treated her with respect, as if he recognized in her something greater than a simple girl helped. There was pride in her gaze, but also something more subtle, admiration. Because he knew that he could have given the same opportunities to other children, and maybe they wouldn't have flourished in the same way. With Lara, it was different. She carried within her an urgency for the future, as if each class was a window to escape the pain, and he respected that deeply. The routine of school, shelter, intense studies began to shape Lara more firmly. She was no longer the candy girl. I didn't even like to remember that nickname anymore, but at the same time he did not deny it. It was part of his history. And although she avoided talking about the days when she asked for coins on the signs, she never failed to remember the feeling of feeling invisible. That drove her, gave her purpose. Books that had once been a mystery now piled up on his bedside. With each chapter read, she felt closer to the dream. She began to participate in contests, signed up for knowledge Olympiads, collected certificates that no one expected to see in the hands of a girl with a past like hers. But Lara didn't do it out of recognition. She did it because she believed, with all her soul, that study was the only solid bridge between what she was and what she wanted to be. On some early mornings, I still woke up scared. I had nightmares about cars speeding up, the sound of horns, the image of the little girl running into danger. But when she opened her eyes and saw the clean walls, the bed made, the uniform hanging from the chair, she remembered that she was safe, and that all that was real. The road was long, the effort was constant. But little by little, Lara realized that she was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming a protagonist, and deep down, she knew, something even greater awaited her. Something that would require everything she had learned, and maybe even more. Time acted as a silent stonecutter, sculpting in Lara something that few saw at first glance, Years had passed since the day his life had taken that improbable turn at the hot, noisy intersection of the city, and everything that had happened since then seemed to carefully build an increasingly strong, determined and luminous version of the girl who, before, was just a forgotten figure among cars and horns. At school, she was no longer that new and silent student. His name began to circulate among teachers, coordinators, and even principals, first for the impeccable grades, then for the awards he began to win. He won medals in math and Portuguese Olympiads, surprised judges at science fairs, and thrilled audiences with his essays. In one of them, he wrote about justice beyond paper, and the jurors did not know whether to applaud the technique or cry for the truth that the text carried. Lara had the gift of touching with words what many did not dare to feel, and the most curious, she never sought to be the best. His goal has always been just to learn, understand, grow. But it was precisely this humility combined with the hunger for knowledge that made her shine. Gradually, the school ceased to be just a learning space to become a symbolic home. It was where she felt seen, valued, where she could dream of security. Even so, he never allowed himself to forget the streets from which he came. Whenever he crossed the city to go to the championships or lectures, he did not fail to notice the children. At the traffic lights, sometimes he would stop looking at them for a few seconds longer, as if he recognized himself in another body. It was as if inside her, there was still that girl with the brigadeiros, and in a way, it did exist. But now, with books in her, arms and purpose in her heart. Over time, Lara began to frequent larger libraries. He entered them as one who enters a cathedral. The silence soothed her, the smell of books enveloped her, and each bookshelf seemed to hide secrets that only she was ready to decipher. He began to be interested in philosophy, history, sociology. I read about civil rights, about social inequality, about justice systems in other countries. And the more he read, the more he felt within himself a growing restlessness. It was not enough to win by itself. She wanted to understand why so many others didn't have the same chance. Why did the system push so many to the margins and welcome so few with real opportunities? It was at this stage that the dream began to take shape. Being a lawyer was not just a career choice. It was a mission. Lara wanted to be part of the machinery that moved justice, but not blindly or coldly. She wanted to be the bridge between the world of laws and the real world, where children like her were born and grew up without a voice. I wanted to fight for them, for those who did not know they had rights, for those who thought justice was a thing of soap operas. When he shared this desire with Judge Estevão, he was not surprised. She had long realized that there was something bigger growing inside her. For him, Lara was not just a success story. It was living proof that a single choice could resignify a destiny. He knew that, with preparation, she would go far. But he also knew that the path to a law school required more than intelligence and will. It required support, access, emotional security. And that is why he decided to support it even more firmly. Paying for studies, opening doors, introducing mentors, all this was done discreetly as he always acted. I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to give back, with silence and respect, the life she had saved years before. Lara took the entrance exam with a mixture of nervousness and hope. It was the first time I felt afraid of not being able to do it. Not because of insecurity, but because I wanted it so much that the idea of failing hurt more than any fall on the asphalt. When the list of approved candidates came out, she read and reread her own name several times. It was there. Right. Public University. One of the first places. The girl who sold brigadeiros on the street was now a freshman at one of the most sought-after colleges in the state. College was a new universe. Full of challenges, suspicious looks, sophisticated environments that contrasted with everything she knew. But Lara was not intimidated. He observed more than he spoke. I read more than I gave opinions, and when he spoke, each word had the weight of someone who carries real stories in his luggage. He was different from the other students. He didn't have a car, nor a state-of-the-art cell phone, but I had experience, and this over time began to attract attention. Teachers noticed his dedication. Colleagues were surprised by his clarity. She was passionate about the study of law, but she also knew that it alone was not enough. It was necessary to learn to apply it where it was most needed. During her undergraduate years, Lara participated in social projects, accompanied public defenders, and interned at support centers for victims of violence. Each experience was another chapter in its construction. But even on the most difficult days, she didn't think about giving up. The memory of his childhood, the looks of contempt, the heat on the asphalt and the hungry nights worked as fuel. And whenever I felt like I was losing my way, I thought of that girl who ran to the middle of the street with a box of candy in her hands, not knowing that she was changing everything. Judge Estevão followed from a distance, always respecting his space but vibrating with each achievement. He knew that the world was about to meet a woman who would make a difference, but what no one knew, neither he nor she, was that fate, with its sharp irony, was preparing a test that would put everything in check. Because sometimes justice itself needs to be defended, and the one who understands this the most is the one who has been on the other side of it. Her senior year of college was everything Lara had ever hoped for, and everything she quietly feared. It was the final stretch of a journey that had begun on the dusty streets of a forgotten city in the southern United States, where she sold homemade sweets on street corners to help her sick aunt. Now on that large tree-lined campus, among sophisticated libraries and young people who grew up in gated communities, she walked with a firm posture. No one there imagined where she had come from, but everyone already knew who she was. Lara was the one who always sat in the front row, she who read the most difficult cases as if she were looking in them not only for laws, but for open wounds in the world. He was the one who asked questions that left the teachers silent for a second longer. Her colleagues respected her, but they also watched her from afar. She was different. It came from somewhere else. He carried an urgency in his eyes that others did not know. Everything was going as expected until a piece of news fell like a bomb, not only on campus but throughout the state. One of the most respected judges on the judicial circuit, the same man who years earlier had given Lara the first real chance to change her life, now made the headlines of newspapers and news sites. Federal Judge Estevão Rocha is investigated for corruption and influence peddling. Lara froze. The name, the photo, the accusatory tone. Everything seemed as absurd as it was cruel. Within hours, the scandal became a topic on CNN panels, in conversation circles in cafeterias, in college classrooms. Sarcastic comments spread. Students who had once praised the judge's ethics now wondered if he had always had secrets. Teachers dodged. Well-known lawyers in the city left his name out of any mention. But Lara knew. I knew who he was. She knew what he had done, not only for herself but for hundreds of people. And precisely for this reason I could not accept it as truth. The accusations seemed fragile, forced, with too many details that sounded like staging. There was no coherence, there was no logic, and yet the world seemed determined to destroy him. For the first few days, she was silent. He watched the chaos set in, the media thirsty for blood, online forums thirsty for scandal, and his colleagues distant and judgmental. But Lara couldn't turn her face away. She knew that this man had saved a life, hers, and that now all he needed was someone who wouldn't run away when the truth began to bleed. She began to investigate on her own. He searched for the released documents, analyzed the investigation records, read the entire reports, listened to the podcasts that dealt with the case, and the more I dived, the more I found inconsistencies, omissions, holes. It was evident. He was being used. A scapegoat on a political chessboard, a sacrificial piece to cover the interests of bigger, untouchable people involved in deep and silent networks of influence. It was as if the whole system she had been studying for years was now upside down. And precisely for this reason, Lara decided that she could no longer just observe. I was close to finishing college. There were weeks left before the American OAB exam, the bar exam, and she knew that if she wanted to defend that man legitimately, she would have to pass. She had to become a lawyer, not out of vanity, but because he needed to have a voice. a voice that the world would listen to not as a favor, but as an argument. As a defense with legal weight, she immersed herself in books like never before. I studied late into the night, among codes, jurisprudence, and statistics. He mixed the doctrines learned in class with the experiences lived on the streets. He reread Estevão's previous decisions, compared them with other similar cases, all with a single objective: to find the key that would dismantle the farce. Meanwhile, the judge remained silent. The newspapers said he was estranged, isolated, in his country home, refusing interviews, keeping his dignity intact even under the weight of public humiliation. For Lara, this silence said it all. He didn't want to defend himself with noise. He wanted to defend himself with truth. And that's what she would do. When the result of the bar came out and her name was among those approved, Lara felt something different. It wasn't just victory, it was a mission. She was officially ready to step into the ring, and he knew exactly what his first fight would be. Now, with a license to practice law, he began to articulate. He gathered allies, sought support from influential professors, mobilized a small group of jurists who still believed in due process. He assembled dossiers, organized forgotten documents, reunited with key witnesses. Nothing was easy. Many doors have closed. Many told her to back down. But Lara was no longer the girl who asked for permission at traffic lights. She was the woman who now knocked on the doors of truth, with the strength of someone who did not accept losing what she believed in most: justice. The judge's case continued to make headlines, but the tide was beginning to turn. Some outlets began to cite the inconsistencies in the process. An investigative report cast doubt on the real interests behind the complaint. Lara's name began to circulate, discreetly, in the legal backstage. Some called her bold, others foolish. But no one could deny it. She was changing the course of a trial that seemed set from the first paragraph of scandal. And while all this was happening behind the scenes, between documents, meetings, and sleepless nights, something inside. Lara was also transformed. She was no longer just the girl who wanted to be a lawyer. She was the lawyer the world needed her to be, because at that moment, fate demanded the same courage from her as years ago, when, as a girl, she ran to the middle of the street to save a life. This time she was running to save another, and there was no turning back. There was something different in the air when Lara walked through the doors of that courtroom for the first time, as a lawyer. It was not only the solemnity of the place, nor the formality of the security guards, the togas, the files piled up on old wooden benches. It was a feeling that came from within, as if all the years of silent effort, all the sleepless nights, all the humiliations and victories had led her there. Not by chance, but by justice. He was there not as a supporting actor, but as the centerpiece of a story that now demanded his courage once again. The looks were almost immediate, some by surprise, others of unbelief. Lara was young, newly formed, and as much as her name was already circulating discreetly among groups that followed the case, no one expected that she would ask to be part of the defense team of the very man who was now at the center of a delicate, political, uncomfortable trial. But she didn't hesitate. She sat down firmly, listened attentively, analyzed each part of the process with the same zeal with which, years before, she organized the brigadeiros in the styrofoam box. The difference is that now she had a voice and intention. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Lara delved behind the scenes of the prosecution. He studied patterns, reviewed records, questioned the very logic of the system. Each night was filled with piles of documents, each morning by precisely designed strategies. He didn't just want to defend. I wanted to expose the truth. She knew that it was not enough to be correct. He needed to be smart. And more than anything, he needed to be patient, as he always was. Many more experienced lawyers looked at her with suspicion. They doubted the ability of a rookie to face a case with so much political weight, but Lara had something that neither of them had. She knew Stephen not only as a judge, but as a human being. I knew what he was made of. I knew their gestures, their values, their silences, and that made all the difference. Because the court is not just about what you say, but about how you look, how you listen, how you feel. The trial began amid cameras, headlines, and an audience divided between those who had already convicted the defendant and those who just wanted to see blood. Lara sat at the back of the room on the first day, watching calmly. It was not the time to expose himself. Still, he let the other members of the team conduct the first hearings. I knew her moment would come, and when it came, there was no fanfare. There was no standing audience. There was only silence and staring eyes. She stood up with the same care with which she had crossed the streets years before, holding sweets. He walked to the center of the room with a serene posture. The papers in hand did not tremble, neither did the voice. As he began to speak, the murmurs ceased, and as the sentences were formed, the expressions of those present began to change. Lara did not only cite laws, she sowed facts with humanity. It showed contradictions, it exposed hidden interests. He overturned fragile arguments with the delicacy of someone who understands that truth is not shouted, it is revealed. With each session, he gained space. Gradually, her name began to circulate with respect. Reporters began to mention her with a tone of surprise. Colleagues who previously underestimated her began to rely on her observations. Even the judge in charge of the case, at first skeptical, showed growing interest in his interventions. There was logic, there was passion, but there was also something that escaped the coach, a real bond. She was not there for vanity. He was there because he knew the price of injustice. Stephen, silent for much of the process, looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and incredulity. For him, each argument launched by Lara was like a mirror of the past being redirected. It was impossible to forget the child with scraped knees who had saved his daughter without asking for anything in return. Now this same girl stood like a woman with a firm voice who saved again, but now with words. On the day of the final speech, the room was packed. There were no more chairs. The case had gained national repercussion. It was more than a trial. It was a symbol, and Lara knew it. When he got up to speak, he did not read what he had written. He looked into the eyes of the jurors, the judges, the audience, and spoke with his soul. He told her who she was, who he was, how two destinies crossed by chance, and how that chance had saved a life. He did not ask for mercy, he asked for truth. He exposed the errors of the process, the fragility of the evidence, the veiled manipulation. He showed that there was no justice when the haste was greater than the analysis. And finally he recalled that the integrity of a man cannot be measured by rumors but by his history. The silence after his speech was absolute. There was no way to continue with empty arguments after that. For the next few minutes, no one moved. It was as if everyone knew that something big had happened there, and indeed there was, because when the verdict was announced, the room erupted in suppressed applause. Judge Estevan Rocha was declared innocent, and his honor was restored. Lara didn't cry right away. He stood motionless as if waiting to wake up. But when Stephen hugged her, saying nothing, just teary-eyed, she felt that all her past, the streets, the sweets, the insults, the pain, had finally found meaning. The world outside was still spinning, hurried, cynical, noisy. But inside that courtroom, a silent and rare justice had been done, and for the girl who was once invisible in the signs, that moment was more than a victory. It was the beginning of something even bigger. The echo of Stephen's acquittal was still hanging in the courtroom as the outside world began to react. It was as if an invisible thread, which connected Lara's story to the hearts of thousands of people, had finally been pulled. All it took was a camera pointed at her, a photo published with the right caption, and the rest happened alone. The image of the young lawyer with an emotional face and a toga on her shoulders went around the country in a few hours. The news outlets rushed to tell the story that began at a busy traffic light and ended, at least symbolically, in front of a judge being acquitted, a judge she herself had saved more than once with actions and words. The interviews came next. Guests on the evening talk shows, special reports over the weekend, opinion columns celebrating the unlikely heroine of American justice. But what was most surprising was the contrast between the brightness of the repercussion and the way Lara kept herself. Nothing about her seemed affected. She spoke clearly, but without vanity. He responded firmly, but without showing achievements. Whenever they asked how she had started, she made a point of going back to her origin. He didn't skip the part of the box of sweets, the humiliations, the difficult nights. He recounted everything as someone who understands that the value of victory is right in the way. And this path for her was not only personal, it never was. Therefore, while the spotlight was still on her story, Lara began to plan what she had been dreaming of since her first year of college. He didn't just want to remind people that justice could be beautiful, he wanted to make sure it could be accessible. Thus, the foundation was born, a space created to offer support to children and adolescents living on the streets who dreamed of studying but did not know where to start. The project grew fast. He had the support of universities, volunteers, spontaneous donations, and even former adversaries in the court who, touched by history, decided to help. Lara coordinated everything. With a discreet and intense presence, I visited the shelters in person, listened to the stories carefully, looked each child in the eye as if to say, without words, I know what this is. And in fact, he knew. He knew better than anyone what it's like to be hungry, afraid, and dreams, too big to fit into his own world. Therefore, his work was never protocol. She was not a lawyer who managed a project. He was someone who every day went back in time to rescue parts of himself scattered in each boy and girl invisible on the sidewalks of the city. The lectures multiplied. Lara was invited to speak at public schools, universities, legal congresses, international forums. She accepted the majority, but always on one condition. She did not want to be called an exception. What hurt him most was hearing that his story was unique or impossible to repeat, because she knew that wasn't true. What other Laras around the country lacked was not talent or courage, it was opportunity, and that's what she wanted to change. For this reason, his speech was always firm, direct, almost uncomfortable for some. He did not romanticize poverty, nor did he sell overcoming as a product. He told truths, hard, raw, and at the same time full of hope. Estevan, now retired, followed everything from afar. He no longer held public office, did not give interviews, and was rarely seen in public, but it was always present where it mattered. He talked to Lara on the phone, exchanged messages, sometimes met for discreet coffees, away from the cameras. He watched her like a proud father who doesn't want to dim his son's brilliance, but gets emotional with each new step taken. She knew that, even with everything she had already achieved, she was just getting started. And there were many moments when he found himself thinking about what would have happened if that day, years ago, had ended differently, if the car had arrived a second earlier, if the girl hadn't had the courage to run, if he himself had never had the chance to meet her. That image still haunted him in the moments of silence. The little girl kneeling in the middle of the street, the candy scattered, the sweaty and determined face of someone who had just saved a life, but now looking at the woman she had become, he understood everything. I realized that there was something bigger behind every detail. That, as unlikely, as it seemed their paths were linked from the beginning by something that went beyond reason. He had given her a chance, and she had given him a new sense of justice. Now she was the one who opened doors, who gave voice, who saved every day other lives with the same naturalness with which one day she crossed the street. And although he didn't say it out loud, Stephen knew that his story was no longer his alone. It had been written by many hands, for the girl's courage, for the woman's strength, and for the silent faith that both carried for so many years. And deep down, he knew the world would still see much more of Lara. Because when someone turns pain into purpose and purpose into action, there is no limit to where it can go. As much as the world now saw her as a successful professional, Lara never allowed the glow of recognition to erase the starting point of her journey. Every step she took, every door she opened, was guided by something she never let out of sight. The clear memory of the girl with broken slippers, the warm sidewalks, the styrofoam on her arms, and the tired eyes that never stopped dreaming. That was why, even with her busy schedule, interviews, events, and foundation growing, she made a point of keeping her feet on the ground, literally and symbolically. A small gesture translated this fidelity to her origin. Inside her purse, Among papers, pens, and documents, she always carried a brigadero. It was not out of gluttony nor out of superstition. It was a memory, a silent but constant symbol of the root that supported everything he had built. Every time he felt the pressure of big decisions or the weight of responsibilities that piled up, he just had to touch that simple package to remember who he was and why he did all that. One morning, while driving home from a meeting with the board of a university that wanted to replicate its NGO's model in another state, Lara stopped at a busy traffic light. I was tired, with my head full of numbers, strategies and commitments, but as always his eyes swept the surroundings with the old reflex of someone who never stopped observing the streets. And it was then that he saw it. A little girl, small, thin, wearing clothes much larger than her body, offering candy to the drivers with a look of shyness and urgency that she knew all too well. The image paralyzed her. It was as if time went back, as if the city, for a second, made a point of reminding her that some things still hadn't changed, and that her mission was far from over. Without hesitation, he parked the car on the side, took his wallet and got off. He approached the girl calmly, without fanfare. He bought all the candies in the plastic bag, without even asking for a discount. The mother, who was watching from afar with a suspicious look, approached slowly, imagining that she might be in front of some authority. Lara talked to her as if she recognized a mirror. No trial, no penalty, no formality. He said he understood, and in fact he did. She handed over her card, wrote down the phone, offered help to enroll the girl in school, buy the materials, guarantee psychological support. He did all this naturally, as if it were an organic continuation of his work, and not an isolated gesture of charity. And deep down it was exactly that. Lara did not believe in charity. He believed in bridges, in accesses, in eyes that do not turn away when they encounter pain. That scene, simple in the eyes of others, was more powerful than any conference or report, because there, once again, the wheel turned. What was once pain was now relief. What was once helplessness was now a path. And Lara knew. If she could touch one life at a time, it would be worth every sleepless night. In the following months, this girl, the one with the bullets at the traffic light, was enrolled in a local school with support from the foundation. She received a uniform, new notebooks, and a room just for herself in a student dormitory maintained by donations. When Lara came to visit her a few days later, she found the girl sitting on the porch, reading a book of stories with her eyes lit up. And at that moment, without having to say anything, he felt that this was the real victory. More than award, shows, more than public recognition or exciting headlines. It was these moments that made it all worthwhile, because Lara understood that real change happens in silence. It happens in the gestures that no one films, in the stories that no one writes. And she made a point of continuing to write these stories every day, with actions, with presence, with respect. In the schools where he lectured, he no longer needed long presentations. His name was at the forefront, but what enchanted him was not the curriculum. It was the way he looked students in the eye, how he asked questions, how he stopped to listen. Young people saw in it a kind of bridge between what seemed to be two worlds too far away, theirs often marked by limits, and the world of those who win, usually distant, unreachable. But Lara showed that the distance could be shortened. With effort, yes, but mostly with chance. With someone who said, "I believe." In every city he visited, in every home he entered, he left more than advice. He left seeds, and these seeds grew. Not overnight, but they grew. Gradually, the number of young people served by the foundation doubled, then tripled. Letters began to arrive from distant places, some handwritten with shaky handwriting, others typed by teenagers who said that, thanks to her, they had gone back to school. They were reports of those who had given up and started over. And as much as the routine was always full, Lara made a point of answering the most difficult letters in person. Sometimes it took days. Sometimes she cried alone when she finished. But he never ignored it, because he knew that for those who wrote it, that answer was more than paper. It was a sign that someone still saw it, someone still cared. This commitment, to the invisible, to the forgotten, to those who remain on the margins, was what kept alive the flame that had always guided her. And although the world said she was now a public figure, Lara never accepted that title as an identity. For her, it was just a consequence, not a fate. The true destiny, she believed, was to continue making other stories like hers no longer rare, that the extraordinary would become every day, that the impossible would lose strength in the face of opportunity. And while she continued with this purpose, while crossing the country in events and projects, while transforming lives without expecting applause, Lara never stopped carrying her little symbol of origin, a brigadeiro wrapped carefully, always at the bottom of the bag, so that he would never forget where he came from, and above all, so that she never stopped remembering herself. It was there, with her hands full of sugar and her heart full of courage, that it all began. If you've made it this far, you've probably felt the same thing that so many people feel when they learn about Lara's story. A mixture of emotion, admiration, and that quiet desire to be part of something bigger. Stories like this aren't just meant to inspire. They remind us of the power that a single decision can have. One word, one hand outstretched, one chance at the right time. Sometimes this is enough to change everything. If this content touched you in any way, enjoy it, and subscribe to the channel. There are always stories around here that make us rethink the world, and even the path itself. Oh, and tell me in the comments, write, "This message was for me," just so I know that you stayed with me until the end. This helps a lot to keep this space alive and full of purpose. And if this video hooked you from beginning to end, leave your like. It shows that the connection we created here was worth it. There's a video here on the side that tells a similar story. Strong, transformative, handful of twists. Click and stay with me there. You will be thrilled again.